For the stars tonight, I won't ever let this feeling go.
I didn't expect to be here tonight, but I want to thank you all for coming.
He grew up in a small town where the nights were warm, the streets were quiet, and dreams were often too big for the place that held them. Yet, inside one little house made of thin walls and fading paint, a young Filipino boy discovered a sound that didn't belong to the world around him. It came from an old radio, crackling, dusty, almost broken, but still alive enough to carry the voice of a legend. The boy would sit close to it every evening, his ears pressed against the static, listening to Elvis Presley as if the voice was speaking directly to him. The world outside was filled with struggles, but the world inside that music felt endless. His name was Marco Reyes, a quiet soul with gentle eyes and a heart that held more hope than most people could imagine. He wasn't born into comfort. He wasn't born into opportunity. He was born into survival. But somehow, that old radio gave him a dream too bright to ignore. His mother, Luz, worked long nights cleaning houses. His father, Ramon, fixed anything he could just to keep food on the table. Neither had the luxury of dreaming. But they loved Marco enough to let him chase his. In the evenings, when the neighborhood fell still and the stars finally appeared, Marco would imitate the voice he heard. Not with the confidence of a performer, but with the longing of a boy trying to borrow someone else's magic. He didn't sound exactly like Elvis then. Not yet. But something in his tone, something deep, warm, unmistakably soulful, felt like the beginning of a future only he could hear. People around him often laughed. A boy like him, singing Elvis songs. In a place where even basic needs were hard to meet. It felt impossible. But Marco kept singing, kept practicing, kept dreaming in silence. He didn't know it then, but every note he tried to copy, every breath he tried to control, was shaping him into someone the world would one day not only notice, but never forget. And somewhere in a distant future, on a stage he couldn't yet imagine, that borrowed dream would finally become his own. The backstage area of the arena was nothing like the world Marco knew. It was loud, bright, and filled with people who carried confidence like shining armor. Some rehearsed their acts with practiced smiles. Others laughed with friends, pretending they weren't nervous at all. Marco stood quietly in a corner, clutching the microphone with both hands. His palms were cold. His heartbeat felt too loud. Every second seemed heavier than the one before. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but imagination never came with this kind of fear. A staff member called his name. His legs stiffened. His breath caught. It wasn't just a performance anymore, this was every dream he'd ever whispered to himself, every sacrifice his family had made, every night he sang beside a flickering radio. All of it was now wrapped into one fragile moment. He took a step forward. The floor beneath him felt unfamiliar, almost trembling, as if it knew the pressure he carried. The long hallway stretched ahead, its bright lights forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow sound and time. But Marco walked, slow and steady, even as his mind replayed the memories that brought him here. He remembered his mother's tired smile when he told her he passed the auditions. He remembered his father pretending not to cry as he packed Marco's small bag for the trip. He remembered the neighbors saying he wouldn't make it, that boys from small towns didn't reach stages like this. And now he was here, one decision away from proving that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. A distance away, he saw the giant stage glowing like a world of its own. The crowd's distant murmurs echoed through the walls. The judge's table waited under bright lights. Everything looked larger than life, yet dangerously close to shattering him. He paused at the final step before the curtain. His hands shook. His chest tightened. For a moment, he wondered if he was enough, if his borrowed dream was too big for someone like him. But then he remembered that small boy listening to an old radio, believing in a voice that gave him hope. Marco inhaled deeply. And when he exhaled, he stepped into the light, where destiny was waiting. The moment Marco stepped onto the stage, the world felt too big. The lights washed over him like waves, bright enough to erase the faces in the crowd. Only the judges were visible, for silhouettes outlined by glowing beams, each one watching him with quiet curiosity. The audience settled into silence. The cameras zoomed closer. Marco stood still, gripping the microphone like it was the only thing anchoring him to the ground. For a second, the noise inside his chest drowned out everything else, the heartbeat, the fear, the memory of every time he was told his dream was impossible. But then he looked toward the stage floor, took one small breath, and raised his head. The music began. And with the very first note he released, the entire atmosphere shifted. His voice didn't enter the air, it filled it. Deep, warm, and hauntingly familiar, yet so raw that it felt new. It carried the soul of Elvis Presley, but with a tenderness that belonged entirely to him, shaped by his struggles, his hope, his story. The audience straightened. Some gasped softly. Phones lifted into the air as people realized they were witnessing something rare, something that didn't happen often enough in a lifetime. The judges leaned forward. Heidi's eyes widened. Howie froze mid-breath. Sophia's hand went to her chest. And Simon. Simon's expression changed instantly. The slight squint in his eyes softened. His guarded posture loosened. His hands slowly lowered as if the voice on stage had caught him by surprise. The arena grew still, as if no one dared to move while this voice, this once-in-a-century sound, was unfolding itself. Marco didn't see their reactions. His eyes stayed closed as he sang, not to impress them, but to pour out everything he had carried for years. Every hardship. Every dream. Every silent night spent practicing in a small home that barely held anything but hope. The more he sang, the more the air thickened with emotion. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling. His voice wrapped around them like a story they didn't know they needed. By the time he reached the first chorus, something had already become clear. This wasn't an audition anymore. It was a moment that would stay with them forever. As the song moved toward its highest point, a quiet tension swept through the arena. It wasn't fear. It wasn't suspense. It was something deeper, an unspoken understanding that they were all standing at the edge of a moment that might never happen again. Marco's voice rose slowly, layer by layer, like a fire spreading through the silence. The softness of his first notes began to transform into something powerful, something shaped by every hardship he had ever faced. It wasn't just talent now. It was truth. The spotlight tightened around him. The background lights faded. For a brief second, it felt like the entire arena had shrunk into a single beam, a single voice, a single heartbeat. Marco reached for the high note. And when he hit it, everything broke open. The sound wasn't just strong. It was full. It carried pain, longing, memory, and the spirit of a boy who had spent years singing beside an old radio. The note trembled with emotion, pushing into the hearts of thousands who had never met him, yet suddenly felt like they understood him. People in the audience rose to their feet almost instinctively. Some covered their mouths. Others reached for their chests. This wasn't excitement, it was connection. A rare connection only a few performers in history had ever created. The camera cut to the judges. Heidi's eyes shimmered. Sophia shook her head slowly, as if stunned by the purity of what she was hearing. Howie leaned forward, barely breathing. And Simon. Simon looked away. Not because he wasn't impressed, but because something inside him had cracked. His eyes lowered. His lips pressed together. He tried to stay composed, but the emotion was too strong, too sudden, too real. A tear formed, not from sadness but from witnessing something that felt bigger than talent. Bigger than the show. Bigger than the moment. The note faded. But the silence that followed was even louder. Marco opened his eyes, unaware of the storm he had created. He didn't see the standing ovation rising around him. He didn't see the judges overwhelmed. He didn't see Simon wiping the corner of his eye, trying to hide it from the camera. He only felt the final echo of his own voice, a sound that had just shaken an entire arena. And maybe even the world. The final note drifted into the air like a soft echo, lingering long after Marco's lips had closed. For a heartbeat, the arena stayed silent, frozen, breathless, suspended in a moment too powerful to break. Marco stood still under the spotlight, unsure if he had done enough. Unsure if his voice had reached them. Unsure of everything, except the quiet trembling inside his chest. He had given the stage everything he had. Every dream. Every fear. Every piece of his soul. Then the silence shattered. A wave of applause crashed through the arena, loud, rising, unstoppable. People leapt from their seats. Hands clapped above heads. Someone near the front wiped tears from their eyes. Another shouted his name. It was not the reaction of an audience, but of people who knew they had just witnessed history. Marco blinked, confused at first. He looked up, finally seeing what he had been too afraid to notice while singing. Thousands of faces, all standing for him. The judges stood too. Heidi leaned forward, smiling with disbelief. Sophia placed her hand on her heart. Howie shook his head as if words had abandoned him. And Simon. Simon Cowell, who had watched some of the world's greatest talents rise and fall, stood still in front of his seat. His eyes were glossy. His expression soft. For once, he said nothing. No comments. No critiques. No smile. Just silence, deep, emotional silence. Not because he didn't know what to say. But because he had felt something too real to speak over. Marco's breath caught as he met Simon's eyes. It didn't feel like approval. It felt like recognition, like Simon had seen the little boy who listened to Elvis through a broken radio, the young man who walked a long hallway trembling, the dreamer who carried years of hope in one performance. Marco lowered the microphone slowly, still overwhelmed, still unsure if this was real. The applause kept rising behind him, louder and louder, until the entire arena felt like it was shaking again, not from music, but from love. As he walked off stage, his steps were unsteady. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of what had just happened. He didn't know what the world would say tomorrow. He didn't know how far this moment would take him. He only knew one truth. On that stage, in front of thousands, he had stepped out of the shadow of a borrowed dream. And risen as a legend of his own.